Now let's begin by welcoming our keynote speaker. Ólafur Grímsson is the former president of Iceland. Throughout a distinguished and varied career, President Grímsson has been praised for his foresight and his initiative in educating other global leaders beyond the Arctic region on how the fate of the Arctic will matter in their countries. He makes connections. Elected 5 times as Iceland's president, he's now president of what's called the Arctic Circle, which brings together more than 2,000 representatives of 60 countries to focus on critical issues facing this region. This morning, he opens our conference with a broad look at the Arctic, the title, The Epicenter of Geopolitics and Climate Change. President Grímsson, you won't hear all the applause on this video link, but please know we are all applauding. Take it away.
Well, thank you very much indeed. And it is a great pleasure to be able to join the Camden Conference again and through this modern method, visit my friends in Maine and re-emphasize, as I did some years ago when I first came to Portland to speak about the Arctic, that if you look at the map of the globe, you realize that it's not only Alaska, which is relevant for the United States with respect to the Arctic, but Maine is in fact what I call the eastern gateway of the United States to the Arctic, through the shipping and other transport lines that link Maine to other Arctic regions in a fascinating way. So although Maine, in geographical terms, might be some distance from the Arctic, you have in recent years become a part of the Arctic in multiple ways. And I will use my speech today to illustrate more extensively why the Arctic has now become, as we call in the title of my keynote, the epicenter of the geopolitical transformation of the world, which is taking place, but also of the urgent climate change cooperation and discussion. You only had to listen to John Kerry yesterday at the München Security Conference when he summarized the task ahead for the new Biden administration and for the world, and where he mentioned the Arctic as a key component of that mission. But I think it is important to realize, because it helps our understanding, that if we go back just 2 or 3 decades, the Arctic was at that time still kind of peripheral part of the world. It was, in fact, what you saw in the opening photographs, in your illustrations, the world of polar bears, indigenous people, remote areas, and a lot of ice. But at a remarkable speed in the last 15 or 20 years, this region has been transformed for being peripheral to the rest of the world to become a core territory with respect to the most profound challenge of our times, climate change, but also a core territory of the new geopolitical race between the United States on one hand and China and to some extent Russia on the other. And whatever you think of President Trump and his administration, it was in fact quite remarkable that he acknowledged, and so did Secretary of State Pompeo, that whereas the Arctic had been remote in US political discourse for many years, it was now through their decision brought into being one of the pillars of the new geopolitical competition structure between China and the United States. And that is indeed a major transformation. But let me start with climate change and the reason why the Arctic is so critical for climate change. There are 2 fundamental reasons. One is that the aggressive melting of the Arctic sea ice is the major cause of extreme weather patterns not only in the Americas, but also in Asia and the other parts of the world. And also, as you are seeing in Texas these very days, as the Arctic warms up, it brings snow and frost and cold weather to the southern part of the United States. And it's understandable that people find that paradoxical. But it's one of the reasons why China, Japan, Korea, India, and other Asian countries are now actively participating in Arctic science and research, because they have realized the extraordinary connection between the melting of the Arctic sea ice and what happens to the Arctic vortex, and the weather patterns, the monsoon, and the possibility of livelihood in faraway parts of the world. The other reason is, of course, the melting of the Greenland Ice Sheet. Next to Antarctica, Greenland has the largest ice sheet on the planet. And it is, in fact, melting very fast. And as I often remind people, if only a quarter of the Greenland ice sheet melt, that will mean a global rise in sea level of about 2 meters. 2 meters. Most of the big cities in the world are, in fact, coastal cities. A rise of 2 meters in sea levels will make most of these cities uninhabitable in the way they have been for decades or even centuries. And I will never forget the moment when the leader of a Chinese expedition up to the Arctic about 10 years ago at a conference I helped to organize in Iceland put on the screen a list of Chinese cities that would completely disappear with the melting of the Greenland ice sheet. These two reasons, the aggressive melting of the Arctic sea ice and similarly aggressive melting of the Greenland ice sheet, mean that every country in the world, every continent, is profoundly affected by what happens to the ice in the Arctic. And as I have often said to my American friends, let us remember that the ice is neither a Democrat or a Republican. Neither supports Biden or Trump. It is simply melting. And the consequences of that melting will hit you in the United States, whether you are a Republican or a Democrat. You say in the presentation of the conference, the Arctic is a region in peril. That to some extent is true. But I would have chosen to phrase it a little bit differently. I would say the world is in peril because of what's happening in the Arctic. Because, as I said, every nation, every continent will be largely impacted by what happens in the next years and the next few decades to the Arctic. My country, Iceland, for example, has the largest glaciers in Europe. They are also the most studied glaciers in the world. At the present rate of climate change, not increased rate, but present rate of climate change, most of them will have disappeared by the beginning of the next century. And the beginning of the next century is approximately when my grandchildren will be the age that I am now. So it is not far away in time, in fact, if we look at it in terms of those livelihoods. But then let me also turn to the geopolitical consequences, which are even more recent than the awareness of the impact of climate change. Why is it that the Arctic is so important in geopolitical terms? There are three major reasons: the resources, the energy, and the shipping. In terms of resources, and I'm not talking about oil and gas, I'm talking about multiple mining, even ocean resources and others. The Arctic and parts of the Arctic, like, for example, Greenland, are absolutely crucial for any large high-tech country in the world. I don't know whether you saw in the news recently that China has decided to limit the export of rare earth metals to the United States, and there they are used in your new fighter planes. So the decision by China on their rare earth metals has a big impact on the capabilities of the US military. The other part in the world where rare earth metals can be found are, in fact, in Greenland. And although most of the media laughed at Donald Trump for saying let's buy Greenland when he sent out that tweet, it was, in fact, quite a sensible proposition if Greenland was for sale, because the mining potential in Greenland, apart from the strategic importance from military terms of the location, are absolutely critical to the future competition between the United States, China, and other major economies in the world. So whether we are looking at Alaska, the Arctic provinces in Canada, or the vast territory in Russia, or even at Greenland, the multiple resources that can be found in the Arctic are becoming increasingly critical for determining who will be the losers and who will be the victors in the 21st century high-tech, IT-driven economy. You cannot really have your mobile phones or your computers, not to speak of your solar panels or your electric cars, without some access to similar metals and minerals that can be found in the Arctic. And if China starts to exercise restricting exports of their minerals and mining resources, and Russia does the same, the US has very few places to turn to except for the Arctic. The other reason, the second reason, is the energy. And there, let me just use Russia as an illustration. I mentioned before that the Arctic part of Russia covers 7 time zones. That is more than twice the size of continental United States. And that part of Russia is extraordinarily rich in energy resources. It is predicted that by the end of this decade, 20% of the global LNG gas will be exported from the Arctic part of Russia. Little over a year ago, Russia and China celebrated an 8,000-kilometer pipeline from Siberia all the way down to Shanghai. Just put on the US map, 8,000 kilometers long pipeline to see the scale of that undertaking. And in areas like, for example, Sabeta in the frozen Russia tundra, where 10 years ago there was absolutely nothing, you now see a Qatar type, in terms of scale, LNG production with harbors for the shipping of that gas to different parts of the world. And Korea, a big ally of the United States, is in the process of building 15 supertankers to transport that energy from the Arctic part of Russia to either Asia or Europe. And it is a wake-up call if you want to look at the new geopolitical relationships to analyze how this Russian-Asian axis between Russia, China, Japan, Korea, and even India is increasingly dominating the energy picture and the energy map of the world. So as the US wants to continue to use energy as a tool in its geopolitical strength, as has been done over previous decades, and we all know of multiple examples of that sort, it will be increasingly difficult because of the energy resources in the Arctic part of Russia. We also have, from Greenland, from Iceland, from the Faroe Islands, from the northern part of Norway, potential for clean energy, renewable energy, hydro energy, wind energy, geothermal energy to be exported through ocean cables over to Europe, like Norway is already building cables to sell clean, renewable energy to either Germany, Britain, or other countries. And the third reason is the shipping. The transformation in Arctic shipping due to the unfortunate melting of the Arctic sea ice, which is opening a new route, the so-called Northern Sea Route, that will link Asia to Europe and America in a way that the Suez Canal and the Panama Canal did a century ago. And although it is a slow-moving traffic, as we see in recent years, the predictions are that throughout this century, it will increase significantly. That is why many of the major shipping companies in the world are already planning their Arctic shipping strategy. And as I mentioned in the beginning, for Maine, which is serving partly as a harbor linking United States through other Arctic countries helped by an Icelandic shipping company, you can now bring containers into Maine and then put them on railway lines and transport them anywhere in the United States. So in fact, Maine is now the interconnector that links, on the one hand, the big US market to the big European market through the Arctic shipping that the Eimskip shipping line is actually providing. But if you want to know further about the plans in this area, both for the energy and the shipping and the mining and the resources, I encourage you to take a look at the new Russian Arctic strategy. It was published quite recently. And it is really a wake-up call to see the ambitious scale of their plans for resource utilization, energy protection, and Arctic shipping. And similarly, I would encourage you to take a look at the recent report issued by the Icelandic Foreign Ministry on Greenland and Iceland in the Arctic, especially Greenland, which illustrates the absolutely critical position of Greenland in this new geopolitical framework, with the United States on one hand and Europe and Asia on the other. So my conclusion is absolutely clear. Whether it is the global campaign against climate change, whether it is the success of the Biden administration climate policy and the future of the Paris Climate Accord, the Arctic will play a crucial role in both monitoring climate change and illustrating the consequences and what is at stake. And in the new power race in the 21st century between the United States on one hand and China and Russia on the other, how these three countries will be able to position themselves in the Arctic will be one of the key determinants about who will be the victor and who will be the loser of the 21st century geopolitical race between the United States, China, and Russia.
President Grímsson, that's wonderful. Thank you so much. And I have been delighted to see that my job is going to be very easy here, because our audience is doing what we'd hoped, which is they're already sending in their questions, and I'm going to get to one in a nanosecond here. Please continue to send us these questions. Send them right now. You're welcome to send questions throughout any of the presentations. List your hometown if you could, as you'll see happened in this first question. President Grímsson, Ambassador retired Deborah McCarthy of Washington, D.C. sent this in. Picks up on some of your comments just now. She asks, at the Arctic Council meeting in 2019, then Secretary of State Pompeo gave a speech to the council members stating that the region had become an arena for power and competition, and that the days of focusing on certain soft cooperative issues were over. Was this a necessary wake-up call to the council? What did you make of that moment back then?
Well, it was certainly not a necessary wake-up call for the council. I think everybody attending that meeting in Finland was quite knowledgeable about the state of play in the Arctic. But what was new about it was that the American administration, in this case the Trump administration, was for the first time in history using an Arctic platform and an Arctic gathering to introduce the race between the United States and China. That had never been done before. And therefore, as I said before, whatever you think about President Trump, his administration and Secretary Pompeo transformed the geopolitical structure as it relates to the Arctic role in that competition. Before that speech, the Arctic was perceived to be outside that competition. Whatever happened in Ukraine, for example, whatever happened in Syria or the Middle East or other conflicts prior to the speech in Finland in 2019, the Arctic continued to be a territory of harmonized cooperation and constructive dialogue. The Trump administration brought global power politics into the Arctic. And although clearly the Biden administration will have different policies, as we see, for example, with respect to climate change, it still remains to be seen what will be the practical position of the Biden administration with respect to the role of China, Japan, Korea, and others, and as well as Germany and France and other observer states in the role of Arctic cooperation. And it will be kind of fascinating to see, because in a few months' time, Russia will take over the chairmanship of the Arctic Council. So the first test of the views of the Biden administration in this respect will come at the meeting in May, where the Russian foreign minister will take over from the Icelandic foreign minister as the chair of the Arctic Council.
One of our wonderful participants named Marion offered the perfect follow-up question. What would you like to see President Biden's new climate envoy, John Kerry, focusing on? You just said it remains to be seen what the focus is, but if you were to be able to set the agenda, what would you offer as a suggestion?
Well, Secretary Kerry is sufficiently well informed about the Arctic not to need any lessons from me. You might know that at the last Arctic Circle Assembly, we gave him the Arctic Circle Prize. He was the second recipient of that prize. Ban Ki-moon, Secretary General of the United Nations, was the first. And Kerry came to Reykjavik and made an extraordinary speech at the assembly of the Arctic Circle. And I know from my conversation with him that he knows clearly the connection between the Arctic and the success or failure of the climate mission of the Biden administration. He also knows very clearly that, in fact, it is a very simple equation. In order to preserve the ice from melting, you need to change the energy system in every country in the world. If we don't change the energy systems, the ice will continue to melt. The sea levels will continue to rise. The extreme weather patterns will be more severe. So it is, in a way, fortunate that we have from day one somebody who is already sufficiently knowledgeable to be able to go straight to the action without having to study first the brief put forward to him. But let me also say, as a friend of the United States, it took the US a while to get involved at that level in the Arctic. Hillary Clinton was the first Secretary of State to attend a ministerial meeting of the Arctic Council. And Kerry did so also in Kiruna, and it was at that meeting in Sweden that China, Japan, and Korea were accepted as observer states. So I can't really see Kerry protesting against the role of China immediately, at least, because he was one of the authors of giving China an observer status in the Arctic Council.
President Grímsson, from Susanna of Freeport, Maine, and she notes that she lived in Iceland while at school. She asks, how would you like to see Maine's relation, the state of Maine's relationship with the Arctic developed? What issues can Maine explore to deepen its connection with this vast region? I mean, I'm already thinking about buying some property near Eastport, Maine, which would have a port near a future shipping route. I'm kidding, but she has a wider question here.
Well, one of the fascinating aspects of the political transformation of the Arctic in recent years is how Maine has come into Arctic cooperation and Arctic dialogue. Before that, you could say that Alaska was perhaps the only part of the United States that played that role. But at every Arctic Circle Assembly in Reykjavik that our biannual event with over 2,000 participants from 60 or 70 countries, Maine has now for a number of years had a formidable delegation. And at the last assembly, the governor participated both in a speaking role and in various other meetings. Your two senators have also become a part of the Arctic caucus in the Senate, which was initiated by Senator Lisa Murkowski a few years ago. So I think already Maine is playing a very important role to indicate to the Arctic that the US is not just about Alaska in the Arctic. And in that sense, I think Maine can also be a bridge builder between the Arctic states and Arctic community and the other parts of the United States. And this is, of course, in economic terms, very important to Maine. It has made Portland one of the key shipping hubs in this merger of new Arctic global shipping lines that we have seen appearing in the last 10 years. So I would simply say to Maine, continue what you are already doing, scale it up, make it more intensive, and also bring young people and ordinary citizens to the Arctic gathering so they can witness for themselves what this cooperation is all about. I remember when I came to Maine, I think, 10 years ago or so, or maybe 8, and spoke at the governor's business lunch and presented this vision of the Arctic and told the audience that Maine was the, as I called it, the eastern gateway of the United States to the Arctic. Everybody looked up from their BlackBerries because they had never heard that before. And the then governor followed up. His successor has done so in an admirable way. Your two senators are taking an active role in this. Your business community, the Port Authority, your scientific community, your officials are all engaged. So in my discussion in other parts of the world, I often use Maine as an example of how the Arctic cooperation has been transformed in the last 5 to 6 years.
And we do already have the acquaintance with the cold weather gear, I'm aware, here in Maine. The next query is from someone who noticed a kind of underlying paradox, President Grímsson, in your comments. You focused on climate change. That's from burning fossil fuel, which puts out carbon dioxide. And yet, here is a region where there are bountiful reserves of, you referred to LNG, liquefied natural gas. So Lindsay Cook from Bonn, Germany asks, as gas is one of the several fossil fuels driving global surface temperature rise, what efforts do you think are possible for a legally binding international ban on any new fossil fuel extraction in the Arctic?
Well, I don't think an international ban will be successful, quite frankly, because these resources are in independent nation states. So like the United States is not going to let other countries tell them what they should do with your natural resources. neither Russia nor Greenland or Norway are going to let other countries tell them what they do with their natural resources. But let's face it, the climate change we are now seeing has not been primarily caused by the fossil fuel resources in the Arctic. It's been primarily caused by fossil fuel resources in the Middle East, in the coal mines in China, Europe, and the United States. So if we really want to stop here now, it would be highly misleading to let the debate simply turn around what happens to fossil fuel in the Arctic. If we want to ban fossil fuel, let's then start with the countries that are the biggest producers. But to some extent, it is also right correct what President Putin says when he justifies his huge LNG investment in Russia. But if you have a choice between the increasing coal mining in China, or as was the policy of the previous American administration to enhance the coal mining in the United States, and increasing the LNG production or the liquid gas production in Russia, it is as an intermediary a better option. So if you are running the PR department of the big oil companies and the big coal companies, you would celebrate people putting all the attention about what's happening in the Arctic in terms of mining or oil and so on. Because at present, the major problem is elsewhere, but it's of course correct. As we move towards the second half of the 21st century or the 22nd century, we also have to take a position on what happens in this respect in the Arctic. But if you look at the cost structure, it is still so expensive to do this in the Arctic that there are very few big commercial enterprises apart from the Russian LNG that is actually taking place there.
An important issue is being raised here for our last moment here with you, President Grímsson, before we see you again in a few minutes, a little bit later this morning. Several people, including Samantha Wood, University of Maine at Farmington student. What about, you talked about rare earths, you talked about energy, but what about the voices of indigenous people in the Arctic in engaging these decisions that have to be made? What are your thoughts?
Well, I think we have to be quite humble in the established nation states of the West that the record of whether it's United States, Canada, Denmark, or even Russia, with respect to the indigenous people is not a very admirable record. If you look at the position of Alaska within the United States 60, 70 years ago, if you look at the role and the democratic rights of the indigenous people in Canada, or if you look at the constitutional position of Greenland, only in the early decades of my own life, for example, they were not exemplary. But fortunately, we have seen in recent decades the empowerment of indigenous people in many parts of the Arctic, the de facto sovereignty of Greenland in most issues, except perhaps defense, is a rare global record of indigenous people moving from not even having home rule or elementary political self-government rights to becoming de facto sovereign state in dealing with other countries in terms of resource utilization, economy, and others. And similarly, the Arctic territories and provinces of Canada, you have seen the indigenous people gaining more power. But when you talk to the various indigenous leaders, they also say to the rest of us, we want to be a part of the modern 21st century economy. You cannot restrict us to simply being examples of primitive living for your photographs and your documentaries in the coming decades. We want a broadband. We want IT. We want ample energy, stable energy. We want to be able to travel. We want to be able to fly around in our huge distances from one part of the Arctic to another. Just take a look at Greenland. This huge landmass with just over 50,000 people, how extraordinarily expensive it is for them to travel from one community to another. So as we make these demands to the Arctic indigenous people, as was the background of the question, let us also recognize that they have the right to become an integral part of the modern global economy on the basis and the premises that they want to decide for themselves.
President Grímsson, thank you so much. I know that you'll be back with us in a few minutes and be able to help us with some more questions. Also, later in the program, as the weekend progresses, we'll hear firsthand from some of the voices of people from indigenous communities involved in the Arctic. Thank you.